my goodness.
I'm actually going to see Kelly on Saturday. We're going to Cirque du Soleil.
Oh, okay.
I thought I had lost this once, and I was kind of color.
Doesn't, you know,
That
it's just like right on the
burns
outside.
down my jowls.
Yeah.
We should ask Sarah if she
That's
can
fine.
go get one of them.
I'll keep using it till it decides to not keep my coffee in there.
Might as well and say, if you're not using it now,
Yeah, right.
Gorilla Glue it.
Mm-hmm. There we are, there's Molly, so. All right, well, it is 10:30. That's when we're scheduled to start our meeting, so we will start our committee of the whole. So we'll look over the agenda. We have minutes from the last meeting in March. And Brady has some things too. All right.
Molly has some things.
Oh, Molly has some things you're passing out.
I'm just passing out.
Okay. So after the minutes, if everybody had a chance to read that, then we have the administrative form of county government would be the next organizational updates.
Madam Chair, that item is in response to some public data requests we had for the administrator's job description and the administrator's contract. And I thought it would be best for us to review Cook County's organizational structure and understand that, because some of the questions were also coming from members of this group. So this is really just background. You can see that the second page is the organizational chart that represents the statutory administrative form of county government.
I have a question.
Yeah.
There's been talk about appointing rural officers instead of electing. How would that change this structure?
Typically in a situation where row officers are appointed, then they fall back down into line with the other appointed officials. So they would move under the direction of the county administrator in that standpoint. In those counties where that has happened, that's what's taken place organizationally. There's a couple of AMC briefs, publications on the role of county commissioner, or the one, so you want to be a county commissioner, what you might expect. On page 9 is the statute, 375A06, that outlines county administrator by the statutory authority to appoint a county administrator. And typically what the roles and rules are when a county makes that decision. So if I'm not mistaken, Cook County made that decision in 2013 and then went forward with the hiring process that brought Jay Kieft on board. Are there any questions about that? The statutory authority and the job description are almost, you take the statutory authority and you put it into the job description, because that's the limits, that's the requirements for the administrator's position, and it's the limits of the authority in that position. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to answer any outstanding questions. What I'd like us to get is to get to a discussion about the board's procedures as they relate to our meeting structure, and confirm some of that and ask some questions. But I did want to give this background, and I wanted to put this out there. And then the last thing in that section is the contract with between the county and myself, which is, again, a very standard contract. The Minnesota City County Manager Association has put forward standard language for contracts for city and county managers, and almost all of them follow that boilerplate. This one does to a great degree. Molly was involved in the writing of this contract and the review of this contract, so she would probably be able to attest to the source, but I know where that comes from because that's what administrators talk about when we have our meetings. Any questions about, that's a decision the county has made, and these are the statutes and the contracts and the rules that kind of define the roles and responsibilities between the board members, the elected officials, and the appointed administrator. So the primary responsibilities that the administrator has is to coordinate the agenda and administer the policies as approved by the board, to coordinate the work of the department heads, and to provide essentially HR director roles for the county, at least support for all of the department heads directly and indirectly. When contract language would specify an HR director, in our instance, it designates administrator because we don't have an HR director in our organization.
I'm kind of confused about that. And so Judy's position is?
Judy is a HR generalist. She was brought in when I first started. Amy Lewick was deputy auditor, and she did payroll, and she did benefits administration, and she did everything else that nobody else was doing in the auditor's office. And when she left, we replaced her with Becky Isbell as the payroll coordinator, and Judy Hill as the HR generalist. And one of her primary functions is the administration of benefits and the documentation and the coordination of all of the behind-the-scenes HR stuff. But when we get into disciplinary, when we get into policy, she does a lot of legwork. But in the case where we have performance issues, in the case where we have contract issues, all those fall to me, the way it's laid out now. So it can be confusing. My title doesn't say anything about HR, but the job description does talk about the major portions of those roles. Other questions about those items? I'm kind of disappointed that we didn't have an opportunity. I understand that Commissioner DeShaw had an interview with Mariah on the phone yesterday because he wasn't able to meet the meeting on the 12th, and they just kept their standing appointment. The rest of us are rescheduled for April 30th. And an assessment of everybody's understanding of our organization and how it works and what's working well and what isn't working well is probably going to be a big focus of those interviews, so that we can determine the appropriate training and team development to apply going forward. So that's the purpose of those interviews.
I didn't know your full name was Jeffrey.
R-E-Y-E-R-Y.
If we could just add something to the discussion. I think some of the confusion with the public, at least that I've been talking to, is that it is the role of the county administrator to recommend certain policies or whatever, and I think some people think that that's a directive, or this is what you should do, and so I think with the public, that's something we have to clarify, that we do make those large decisions, but we look to you to recommend, certain procedures, or coming from committees and so forth. And I think it's worthwhile clarifying that that is an appropriate role of the administrator, county administrator, to make recommendations.
It's a primary role, but yes, that is an important clarification.
But we make the decisions.
If you go back and listen to the tapes at Truth and Taxation or some of the other meetings, I hope that I'm clearly outlining that there are options that are available to the board, that we're available to do the research, that we're available to answer the questions, and then our responsibility is to implement the policies as approved by the board.
Yeah, that's number 3, so it's pretty high on the list of responsibility. Develops and submits recommendations on policy. Not that these are in order of importance, but.
Where are you?
Where are you?
The position description, I think it's page 15 in your packet. Number 3, the very bottom line.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Develops and submits recommendations on policy and procedure matters to the county board.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, just a bit back in the statutes. It's within there too.
It, the job description for the administrator and the job summary almost carry verbatim from
Mhm.
375 A06.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, we can move on, Jeff, then to procedure and rules.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And under procedures and rules for Cook County, I think if we have two goals out of this meeting today, it's to define a couple of questions that we can further clarify for you. And one of them is a confirmation of the 2019 rules and procedures that the board adopted in January at the organizational meeting. A clarification of terms, a discussion of different types of meetings. We'll get into that. But second one, maybe a little further down the road, we took a shot at this a couple of years ago when we first proposed the standing committee structure, and we talked about identifying a set of bylaws for the Cook County Board of Commissioners. So the two things next there are samples from Itasca County and from Scott County. And there are elements in each of those that would probably be helpful, be useful. The Itasca County one. The St. Louis County one is 350 pages long, so I didn't put it in the packet. There are elements of that also would be helpful. I think each of you have learned through the Association of Minnesota Counties that all of us operate along the same rules and guidelines that the state provides, so borrowing the best practices from other counties is often a shortcut to getting us to where we need to be. So I just throw these two out there as examples that if we decide we wanted to move forward with developing a set of bylaws for the Cook County Board of Commissioners, there'd be a starting place. They both reference statutory requirements, open meeting law, data practices, data retention, all of the schedules that we have to make. And there's a couple of pieces in there that we may refer back to, specifically related to definitions of workshops or work sessions, or in the clarification of public comment or public opportunities to interact with the board and the board's responsibility to the public. Specifically, Scott County has clarified that even more than the recommendations that are posted in the AMC materials. I think.
So are you referring to page 3? Standing rules, time of the meetings, work sessions? Is that the part you're looking at? I don't know who did it. It just says,
On the front. Are you looking at,
I'm looking inside.
right, but there's 2 different county descriptions.
Mhm.
This one's Scott County. She's looking at the one
This
that's
is-
not Scott County.
That's right,
So,
Itasca.
yeah.
so that is just parroting back the
Right.
language that the county will have an organizational meeting and they will establish the
Right.
rules for the year.
Mhm.
And then there's subsequent portions that clarify some of the other definitions within that. But yes, I'm just suggesting that if we wanted to pursue a set of bylaws, we could use these
Okay.
as some sample language.
Right, okay.
The old typewriter font is the Itasca County one. The nice, clean, legible font is the sample that's put out by Scott County.
Oh, okay.
And they, to the extent that they talk about statutory responsibilities, they both say the same thing. Scott County has just clarified a few other things. The in my experience, the metro communities, counties, and cities have just had to get better at the administration of these requirements than the rural communities and counties have had to, because of the density, because of the number of requests, because of the public scrutiny. So oftentimes, they can provide a better sample than some of our rural peers because they haven't gotten to that level of operation. That's what I really wanted to do, was to provide some background. Molly, did you want to address the memo that you prepared?
Sure, and this came out early this morning. Should have come out last week, but the darn storm. My memo asks the board to discuss and establish some policies and procedures regarding which meetings should be recorded, video recorded, and also to discuss and establish procedures for public comment. This has been a matter of discussion as recently as the organizational meeting, but no decisions were really made regarding recording or public comment. I watched the video, and I think that the only decision that was made is that when the regular meetings would occur and then when the committee of the whole work session would occur. And so no real changes or decisions made about how to consistently, whether there should be a consistent application of any rules regarding recording. So my memo is here for your reference. In summary, I think we aren't required legally to record meetings unless it's a closed session that's not an attorney-client privilege session. There are good reasons to record meetings. There are also costs associated with recording meetings, both actual financial costs and then and more kind of metaphorical costs. And so I kind of outlined some thought costs and benefits that I identified. You may identify others and prioritize them differently than I did. It's my suggestion that work sessions in general not be recorded. I think the value of recording them is lessened by the fact that there is no official action taken in work sessions. And I think the potential cost of recording them is heightened because recording has kind of a chilling effect on the discussion. You should have free and open discussion at work sessions so that you can consider all alternatives and ask the questions, even the stupid questions, and not be always afraid of how your words will be mischaracterized or taken out of context. So I think it would be wise to establish a policy and then to consistently apply it, because I think the risk of just flying by the seat of your pants and deciding for each different meeting event is that you will be, there will be a perception that you make those decisions based on the subject matter of the meeting or based on who is in the room, what they might say, that kind of thing. Whether or not that's the actual reality, I think that perception. And it will also just provide some guidance and a little more stability in that decision making. So it's not a debate every time.
No, it makes it easier for us to answer. We can say our policy is.
Mm-hmm. So both the recording and the public comment, those are things that could be included in bylaws. I see in the Scott County bylaws, they address broadcasting and videotaping of their meetings. So that's something that you could include in bylaws. You could also not wait until the complete set of bylaws is created and passed, if that's your intention, but just pass a standalone kind of a policy. And I think the board heard my thoughts on public comment back in January, and that public comment is really designed as a listening session to hear out the concerns of the public. And I don't recommend it become a dialogue, you can set, and I think the board voiced some interest in that organizational meeting and setting separate events for that purpose, for the dialogue purpose. But our regular meetings and our work sessions have a purpose beyond the dialogue. In regular meetings, we should be addressing the agenda, doing the business of the county, and you don't want the dialogue to take over. It could become an open-ended discussion and just take up too much time. And we have limited time. Everybody has taken time out of their schedules to meet as a group. You can have that dialogue with constituents separately. I also attached to my memo what I think would be a good, standard thing to read at the beginning of each meeting about the public comment period, which makes it clear that, we're not here today to answer questions. We're happy to hear your questions and to hear your concerns, but we have limited time to do our business, and questions deserve a researched and thoughtful answer. Often you're getting questions on county business that happened months ago. You might not have a memory of that, and you might be being asked tough questions that really deserve a prepared, thoughtful answer. You shouldn't be required to answer those on the fly. So I would suggest that this be an item for the April 23rd agenda. I think it would be good to have a policy on recording pretty promptly here. It's something that's been kind of a matter of debate, it seems, for the last couple months.
So let's open up for questions. I guess my first one is, I think we need to define what is a work session. Is this a work session? Yep. Is the Budget Committee a work session? What is a work session? What do you all think?
So
How do we define that?
Madam Chair, if I could, the last page is a draft that takes a shot at answering those questions. The last page in the first section, the page that has the green and the blue and the red shading on it. Nope, the page just before that.
Just a second.
Green and the blue.
Oh, yes.
Page 60, is it 64?
Yeah, and that's really small. It's much easier to read on the screen, but the next page with the Venn diagram is also useful, but the Board of Commissioner meetings are the required public meetings where we do our business. And that is a regular meeting, and a regular meeting means that it's something that we've put on the schedule at the organizational meeting. So we have made the notice that our regular meetings are going to be on the second and fourth Tuesday at the Cook County Courthouse at 8:30 in the morning, which means we don't have to provide any other notice to those meetings. Those are our regular standing meetings. That's when and a regular meeting versus a special meeting versus an emergency meeting are very important statutory definitions for us to understand. A work session is an optional special meeting of the Board of Commissioners to discuss issues or policy options before referring an issue to a regular board meeting for a vote. So that could be called to discuss the budget. It could be called to have a conversation about the 1854 treaty. It could be a standing work session. Committee of the Whole, this meeting, is a standing work session to discuss the continuing business of the standing committees, Public Safety and Transportation, Personnel, and General Government and Budget. Those are the three standing committees that the board adopted. I'd have to actually look and see if we actually adopted it or if we just started practicing that about 2 years ago. But a work session is just simply an informal meeting with a quorum of the board, very likely to be there, which makes it an open meeting, but it's to discuss a specific policy, to develop policy options, to provide staff with directions to do additional research, to bring it back for appropriate discussion. So that's all that a work session is. It's really as it was brought to discussion and brought to me 3 years ago, was when do we have an opportunity to discuss the business at hand without having to have the pressure of taking a vote? That's essentially the definition of a work session. That's the opportunity for us to discuss policy options, ask questions, ask for further research without the board being under the scrutiny of having to take a vote on the issue right then. So committee of the whole is just a specific standing, regularly scheduled work session that falls in line with the other committee structure that the board has authorized. So that it's really important to understand that. And if you don't like that term, then we can just say this is a standing work session, because that's what essentially committee of the whole is.
And so I'm trying to match up these two.
They relate. They don't correlate.
Right.
So the Venn diagram, the circle with the circles inside of it.
The board work sessions.
No, it's a definition of the types of meetings that the Board of Commissioners may hold. And there's the big circle of the public meetings that we have. So everything within the big circle is a public meeting. The regular Board of Commissioners meetings, I think everybody's clear on that. Town hall or informational meetings, when we have them to discuss County Road 45. You may or may not have a quorum of commissioners, but they end up being public meetings. Public hearings, those that are statutorily required, like truth and taxation, or equalization hearings, or hearings related to the issuance of debt, or publication or changing of ordinances. Special public hearings. The board can call a public hearing on things that they're not required to because they want to invite more participation. The rules of public engagement at a public hearing are more specified than they are for regular sessions. So that's one of the reasons why that's separated from a regular board meeting. And then board work sessions, one subset of the board work sessions, committee of the whole is one example of a standing work session. Other work sessions might be for, we said, strategic planning, for budget, for any other policy development.
So those board work sessions would be the standing committee meetings that call for
No. Nope. Everything in that blue circle is up on the top in the green.
everything in the blue circle.
Everything on the circle diagram
Oh, gotcha.
is defined in the green section.
Yeah, the green table.
I think, too, if I may, at least in my mind, a distinction also is that we more than likely will have a quorum at those green ones, or the Venn diagram, whereas the other ones we don't necessarily. And I guess, Michael, to me, that should be a distinction in regards to, where it goes as well. But I'm open to that. But it seems to me that if we're going to set some policies and so forth, we have to look at, quorum as a factor.
It absolutely is. So all of the green ones are identified as being public meetings, meaning open to the public.
And more than likely a quorum.
And the blue ones are the established standing committees, which each of you serve on at least one, public safety personnel.
There's typically 2 commissioners on those.
They're intentionally planned as not having a quorum so that they can be policy development with staff.
And advisory would have 1 or 2 commissioners on them.
Well, advisory are completely optional. We don't have to have those. We do have several advisory committee meetings established at this point. Last year, the Budget Advisory Committee meeting met with the General Government and Budget Committee. They combined, and there was not a quorum of commissioners there, so it was part of the standing committee. This year, the request was that the budget workshops be held with the full board. So
Did we act on that as a board?
we did not act on, well, we did act on that when we scheduled it for next week.
And we approved the members on it.
Well,
Well, I think there's some confusion on that, because I know in discussions we've had, and I'm open to consider anything from my point of view, but I sort of like things in defined policy. And if we're going to have commissioners, a quorum of commissioners at a budget advisory committee, then that changes its status, in my mind.
It's a budget work session, as we just previously described work session. It's an opportunity to discuss policy options.
But have we decided formally that we would go this route?
I thought we did.
I
I don't
when
know
we
that we
scheduled it,
voted on it. I know
when
we
we scheduled
talked
it, we
about
did.
it.
We approved the advisory committee with the 5 representatives
2
from the
years ago,
different,
yeah.
from the districts, yeah.
But then this
Well-
year, we talked about having all of the commissioners
We did.
during the budget.
Right.
But we didn't make
We
that
haven't.
decision, and I guess if we're going to do that, I think we
Right.
need to make that decision.
That's a decision for you to make as a group.
Mhm.
And, so then that, in my thinking at least, it does raise it to a different kind of category.
Yeah, then it's a work session.
That's a work session.
It does,
So
but
then
I
it would-
think the question behind your question is whether or not that meeting is going to be recorded. And the,
Well,
and
but-
the
yeah.
question behind that question is whether or not we record work sessions as a policy, or just the regular board meetings and other required meetings.
Well, yeah, and my point is, right now, budget is under an advisory committee meeting, and if we're going to have all commissioners there, I think we need to take action on that procedurally and in a policy, and then it would change its status, in my mind at least, to, I guess, a public meeting, but it will have advisory members that we selected from each district to be on it. But maybe it's just something unique in its own nature.
We actually have it posted and noticed for next week as a budget workshop. That means
Okay.
it's open to the public, and if we extend a special invitation to specific members of the public, there's nothing contradictory with that.
But my question is, did we take formal action to do that, or
I
Post
believe,
it.
I think there was consensus from the board that the board members wanted to all be present at budget discussions.
right,
I don't recall that.
I do. Do you?
Yeah.
So we
Well,
went
with
around.
hesitation, though. It's kind of
And
like.
I'm not
we-
advocating one or the other,
Right,
but I think
right.
from a policy.
I was hesitant because it changes the whole atmosphere of working on the budget. But Commissioner Dukirk asked that the board receive more information about the budget planning. So we've gone from maybe, us reporting, Commissioner Bersheim and I are on the budget, from us reporting to the board now to the whole board. So it will make a difference. But, in the past, we have changed horses in midstream, and we've tried different things, so are you willing to give that a try?
And in the past, the budget process was not a work session or an advisory committee. It was a part of the board meeting.
Mhm.
And decisions were made as we went through the budget.
Mhm.
So then you're saying it should be part of the board meeting?
I'm not saying anything, I'm telling you the history.
Well, I'm just,
Well,
and
you
I'm
wanna
not
make-
advocating one way or the other, but
Yeah,
we have these
right.
advisory members
Right,
on there, and
which
then
is
all of a sudden
different.
it's a board meeting or a
Right.
board work session,
Right.
and so then that changes the dynamics.
It does.
And
when it was-
I'm not
when
arguing
it was
one way or the other,
conducted-
but let's just take
Mhm.
some action and develop policy.
And when it
Mhm.
was part of the county board meeting, the public was allowed to discuss during the county board meeting and have input, which I know is not how we conduct business now, but that's how it was before.
So this conversation clearly illustrates the fact that the
That we
board
need
does
this.
not have a general agreement on terms or rules.
Mhm.
And so I think that the recommendation is that we develop an agreement on the terms and the rules.
Absolutely.
Every one of these options is an option that's available to this board. And every one of these options is an option that this board has chosen at some point in the 4 years that I've been here. But that also lends to a confusion with the public to not understand what to expect.
And if I could add too, that, you know, when we formed that advisor committee, and here again, I'm not arguing for or against this, I'm just saying process. I'm sorry I say that a lot, but we informed these advisory members of the budget committee that they would participate in this process. And now we're telling them, well, the board is going to be there too. That's fine. But we change things, and I think when we do change things, we should go through a more formal process, which we're doing now, which is good, but to define it. And so as it sits right now, if we're going to have the board there, then it's no longer under this beige color. It's a work session.
Exactly.
But it's going to be a work session with advisory.
Work session is open to the public. That doesn't mean you can't invite specific.
But we have appointed advisory members that have invested a year of their time.
They can still be part of the process with us.
Okay. My point is, where does it belong? I think it doesn't belong where it is on the sheet. That's my point.
Last year, it got really confusing, Commissioner, because we blended the general government and budget standing committee with the advisory committee, and there was no separation. And we do still have the general government and budget committee that has an opportunity. We met on Tuesday last week, and we talked about the clarification of some of these policy issues. And if we were going to further clarify some of these other issues, definitions and roles and rules, and develop a set of bylaws, I would think that the task would be sent back to that committee and the staff on that committee to make recommendations that would be discussed and researched and brought forward to this group again.
Brady, when we used to do the entire budget during the board meeting, we had also a budget committee that worked separately, right?
There was a few years where we had 3 members of the public sat in with the full board.
Well, but
As we
Bruce
reviewed.
Martinson and I were on a budget committee where we sat with department heads and went through the budgets.
Yeah, we've had different, so I thought you were talking about we had the individuals of the public. So we
Yeah.
had some years of that, where we had 3 people, not 5. And then we had years where we had a committee that would sit and meet. I think that was more short-lived, more recent.
Right.
We had the board chair and the vice chair were the budget committee since I've been here.
Mm-hmm.
And the budget advisory committee was a suggestion that was brought forward about a year and a half ago to involve additional public, a sounding board of members of the public for the policy options that were being discussed. That's truly what the advisory committees are, and we have not. We have to be very careful that we don't grant decision-making authority to any of our committees, because even if we do, then even without a quorum of this board, they become subject to open meeting law. So they're all advisory in nature. They're all, to some degree, just coming up with some sort of a consensus, or at least the consensus of, hey, here's 2 or 3 policy options that we think should be further developed. And that's about as much decision-making authority as any of our standing committees or any of our department committees or anything that has to go before the board. The level of authority before it gets to the board is to come up with some sort of a consensus of here's the policy options that ought to be considered. But the discussion and the review and the decision amongst policy options always has to happen with the full board, because that's the only authority that we have named, except for the places where we named other, like the Planning Commission.
Well, then it sounds like we've been all over the place. We've had different experiences. So, we can try it with the full board advisory committee. I just don't know how we would handle any more public input at the meetings, at our budget meeting, because we already have 5 public already there. So what do you advise on that? If the public will be here, do we acknowledge any input from them?
That's, Madam Chair, that's why we need to refine what our public
Right.
process is at meetings.
Right.
And if you look to the examples in the Scott County bylaws, at a work session, the work session would be the people who are invited to the work session to participate. Everybody else is in the room observing. So if we invite 5 people to participate at this table at a work session, everybody else would be observing.
So observing and
if-
not being recognized.
Exactly.
Okay.
And
That's
if
what I need to know.
that's the level of distinction that we want to make, we can make that. There's plenty of reason for making that level of distinction. If you want to take and have a town hall meeting about the budget, which we've done recently,
Right.
then we're making a presentation of, here's the things we're considering, we're asking you for your input. That's a different level of public participation. So that's why some of these building blocks are the things that we have to come to some general consensus on. And a chart, like the one that I presented, is completely in draft form. But if we have something like that, it's an illustration, basically, of the set of bylaws that we might create.
If I could just reiterate that I think it would be more clear and understood by the public and as well as us, that if we decide to do these things, we take formal board action. So as we go forward, that's what we would do. And so my question is, where are we going to put budget in here?
You want to define it as a work session, or are you looking for a title to it?
I'm asking, and I think we need to, and that could be part of our next board meeting, or
Isn't
at
that-
some point in time.
Isn't that one of the basic definitions, is it becomes a public meeting if there's 5 commissioners?
Mhm.
Or quorum.
Commissioner Bersheim's
maybe
question is
three.
whether or not our preliminary budget conversations are going to be with the full board or with just 2
Yeah.
commissioners.
And he's wondering where it goes, and it's.
Yeah.
you know,
And
I
I-
like it as a work session so we can invite people to be part of the discussion and make that clearly defined.
Who are the people?
The advisory committee,
Okay.
if they would like to participate.
Well, we already are. Right?
Right. And
Yeah.
you can't force people. Bobby?
So you're saying you want the whole board on the budget committee?
No, I'm just saying, number one, I don't think we took formal action to change what we have right now. We have the budget committee. So if we're going to have the board there, then I think the board should take formal action, because there gets to be confusion if we don't. That's my point, and I'm not arguing one way or the other. I'm just saying that let's get some clarity and set up a process in which we make those decisions rather than assume that we think that way. That's my point. So and we can't decide that here now, but I just think that we've got to clear up some of these confusions, and the best way to do that is to take motions and approve certain things at board meetings.
So we have two.
And I
two
think this
things then.
process is great, and thank you for your work on it. I just think we've got to clean it up.
So we would have 2 things to consider. One would be for the Budget Advisory Committee to be as a whole board, or we continue on with the 2 advisory representatives from the board, reporting back to the board occasionally once a month. We meet once a month, so maybe after that meeting, we report back to the board a summary of what's going on. Anything else we should consider? Those 2 options, or? I mean, that's the way it looks like we're discussing. 2
Or we
ways.
have it as a continuation of the county board meeting. So
Okay.
that we can take action as we go through the budget.
Well, that's an option. That's not
That's
how
an
it's
option.
noticed now.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, she's giving options, I'm telling you,
Okay.
there's another
There's
option.
another.
In some ways, we already do that. They bring in budgets and then we vote on them
The-
throughout the year.
The majority of the major budgets, Commissioner Deshaw, you're absolutely right, were presented to the full board anyway.
Yeah.
I will, you generally, the board has to give, at some point, the full board has to give the advisory group some amount of direction, because they have no authority or discretion, and they don't necessarily know the responsibility of the county as an organization or the commissioners as individuals. So you can't designate that authority to them. That's part of what I was trying to say before. And there's policy issues related to budget development that need to be reviewed by the full board. So there's nothing saying you can't refer something to that group. You know very well, the Highway Advisory Committee is right now currently the longest standing, I think, best functioning advisory committee that we have. And we're doing really good work, but we're doing policy review and operational review, and then we're giving that direction to the department head to incorporate in the budget, which is then coming to the board for confirmation. So that's really good process. I think I have one other illustration that I want to walk through a little bit, but we're parsing really fine details, and there's absolutely room for the board to call a work session to work on budget issues as a quorum, as a regular work session. And there's plenty of room for an advisory committee to be reviewing policy options related to policy development related to the budget. The biggest problem I saw with last year's policy, with advisory budget committee, was that some of the members believed that they had line item veto or line item discretion in the discussion of the budget. And this board decided 2 years ago they don't even want line item discretion. They want to work with department heads to set policy goals and then question the major assumptions that are coming up behind how that represents itself in the budget. That's one of the things that we need to further define. If there's a budget advisory committee that continues, then we really need to provide the scope of that operation and make sure that they understand the limits, that there's no authority transferred, it's to help staff refine the questions before they come to the board for discussion. That's what an advisory committee does.
And I think too that advisory committees, from my experience, at least in education, was they have a set agenda to advise on. And so that agenda is set, because then you don't get into this whole area. But I still think that we have to define, first of all, if we're going to have the board there, and then that in itself will maybe have some impact on what we do in those meetings.
Yeah, and I want to apologize. I seem wishy-washy on this. I mean, I think starting out, I wanted to be as involved as possible in all of the process, and what I'm learning is that I can't be involved in every aspect of all of these committees. And so I think there's a lot of value in having us parsed into different committees. And of course, the budget is at the forefront of a lot of our discussions, and so I thought that one might be especially beneficial to have all of us there. And what I'm thinking at this point is that it makes sense to kind of keep things as they were, but then having, if we want, all board member work sessions as needed or whatever. Which I think is different than what I was thinking not long ago, maybe a matter of weeks. I was thinking we should all be there for all of them, and now I'm just like, I don't know if that's very realistic, and it's going to change the dynamic. I don't know how productive that'll be. So if we want to change how it is, I'm still open to that, but that's what my current thoughts are.
Well, I'm not arguing one way or the other. I think it's at the discretion of the board, but we should make a formal decision. And
Not here. No?
yeah,
Dave,
no, that's, yeah,
Dave,
no,
could you move a
I
little
think I
bit
said
to
that
your
earlier.
left? I've got a glare of
no,
a windshield.
We're not here to decide
Yeah.
that today, but I'm just
No.
saying that we should at some point decide.
Oh, the other one. Oh, no, over there.
And then
That one.
And then
Yeah.
we would have to talk about that. It's going to be a little different than it's been in the past, so how are we going to do it differently?
No, that one.
Is it?
That one.
But maybe it can work with having advisory committee members But when we make changes, my point is we need to take formal action.
Thank you. Right.
Can I ask you, what would you be bringing to the board next week? What would you like us to decide?
I think that, number one, if we have my guess this is open for discussion, and I certainly could be convinced differently, but to me, there seems to be certain triggers that we should have for our decision-making process, and so when we change something, we have to take some action on it. So I guess the first question is to take some formal action on whether or not this is going to be a work session of the board rather than an advisory or a standing committee. It's actually an advisory committee right now. And then it would somehow or the other move up to a public meeting because there's a quorum there. But I think first of all we have to decide whether we want all the commissioners there. And
I
you know,
think
that's
Dave
up.
defined it pretty well. I mean, we can leave an advisory committee and have work sessions.
But when you say decision-making with that group, you can't make a decision. We make our decisions at the county board meeting.
I'm not saying we should make decisions in any of those, no. They're only advisory. A work session would be to me, a work session is not making decisions. When we have a work session like committee of the whole, or if we had a work session on the budget, then we would not make decisions. That's, to me, is a distinction.
That's
Right.
correct. Yes, my
And the
understanding as well.
advisory doesn't make decisions either.
Right.
Well,
Yeah, I don't think
Right.
I've ever implied that.
So I think if
But-
there were three questions that I keep hearing that we need to resolve is, how are we going to proceed with this year's budget conversation?
Yep.
What are we going to record and what aren't we going to record? And how are we going to handle public comment or public interaction at each of the different types of board meetings? So if there was a way to go back and use the existing committee structure that we have to review this, I think it would be to refer it back to general government, have a conversation, make a recommendation, even if we don't go back to them. You could ask us to provide a recommendation and have conversation and bring something to the board next week for discussion and a decision, or discussion and a continuation.
And
But
almost all of that would be answered if we made a policy.
well, if each of those questions were answered, it would help to make the policy, it would help to approve a policy later. But I think, are those three questions that I keep hearing repeated?
Yeah.
I think so.
mhm.
Yeah, and I think then something that's subordinate to that would be, what will the role of those advisory council members be in this work session?
Specifically the budget advisory.
Yes. So that would be a separate kind of, so I think they know and we know what their role is going to be, because I don't think that's been clear.
In the advisory, in the budget advisory.
Well, I think number one, you have to determine if it's going to be the board or continue as it was.
Yeah.
And, you know, and then define their roles a little bit better. Because in the past, there was just two of us, and now we're going to have the full board, or quorum of the board. And then what is their role in that? I mean, what is their role?
Sounded to me like they didn't know what their role was last year.
Well, I think we
Oh,
talked,
sure.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
I was there, and I think we talked about it, and some people
Yeah.
just had a penchant for getting their word in. But, you know, we did talk about advisory, and at the end, we said, thank you for your information,
So what
It-
was their role?
to advise.
So how would that be different in a work session?
I'm asking.
I don't see how. it
Well,
would
I
be
think,
different. That's what I'm asking.
yeah, I think we have to define that because some didn't understand that. One way to do that is to set an agenda where we want input, rather than just say, let's talk about the budget.
I I have copies of all the agendas and all the materials that we brought last year. And I have a copy of
Yep.
the
And I think-
agenda from the June meeting where we talked about the role of the individual members in this commission. So that,
I'm not disputing that at all. I'm just saying that we do need to.
Well, it can get confusing, I mean, even now we're talking
Can be.
about what our roles are,
Yeah.
and their structure, so it's not, I mean, I completely can relate to any confusion, but.
Well, and it was new for us, and we set out right from the beginning, Jeff set out the agenda for the roles of the commissioners, the 2 representatives, and the folks at large. And every once in a while, we had to remind them,
Sure.
you know, because it was all new.
I need reminders often.
There you go.
Yeah, and I guess my point is, you know, it's more work, but what do we want them to advise on? We set that agenda. And I think that was structured, and that's fine. But
I would be careful of the word advise. We're not actually, I mean, it's advisory board, I mean, I don't want to get hung up in, but we're not asking for the public to advise you on that. You are being advised by your staff on the budget needs. I would say the advisory boards function more as a sounding board for policy options. Public input, they're a sounding board of the public's thoughts on proposed policy.
so let's not call it advisory then.
Well, it's,
That's what they're called.
Yes. I know.
Highway advisory, it's,
Mhm.
I don't want to get hung up in definitions, but we have to, I think there's still 3 questions. How are we going to organize our budget conversation for the year? Which includes all of the discussion we just had. What are we going to do about recording? You know, 3 years ago, we made a decision not to record anything except the board meetings. And that decision was changed without board action. And then how are we going to handle public comment and public input at the various types of meetings that we will schedule? I think if we clarify those things, and we're just going to provide the options, and you guys will have to take action to clarify those things if you want to clarify those things.
I think we need to. I realize
Mhm.
Itasca's is typewritten. So page 10, hearing recordings, it's very interesting. It goes back to the typewritten era, where it says, verbatim record of all public hearings will be made by means of tape recording or electronic means, if deemed appropriate by the chair. Be the means of the court reporter. The public is specifically allowed to preserve and record the proceedings of a county board meeting at any of its hearings by using a voice recording instrument. Court reporters, stenographers, or other reasonable means of recorded preservation.
I would clarify that that falls under the heading of public hearings, which is different than the heading of other public meetings.
Okay.
And it's specifically
But it's just
differentiated
interesting
in
that
statute.
it's all laid out and it's very
Mm.
old language of how we record things these days.
I think it's
So-
actually still consistent with statutory language related to public hearings.
So Jeff, do you want to take those 3 areas?
I would suggest, Madam Chair, it'd be good for us to put those policy questions and
Okay.
forward them to the 2 of you, and Brady and Molly, and I don't know if we need to have a meeting, or if we can just have a consensus that that's the policy we want to add to the agenda for next week to discuss.
The question is, should we make a decision whether all, you know, that the commissioners are going to be at the budget meeting? Or are we going to assume that?
And you have to decide that as a group at a board meeting, not at a work session.
Didn't we already schedule a work session?
Mm.
No?
Budget meeting next week, the beginning. And you were going to lay out pretty light guidelines. We really don't know where we're going right now, but you were going to outline some goals and, again, remind them their role.
Primarily going to provide some context for where we are and how we got here. Because there's no department level budget data to work with until we get into June or July.
Right.
I think all the ones that we're working on budgets on, public health and human services and so forth, they need to take the direction from the commissioners, because we are the ones that have to vote on the levy. You know, the advisory board is fine, but
Mhm. Right, that's.
ultimately,
yeah.
we're the
Oh, yeah.
ones,
Right. Right.
you know, if they have a big levy, the person needs to tell them, you know, we need to look for cuts here.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if we go forward with this and we have all the commissioners, let's just say if, at the budget meetings, then should these presentations be made from the large departments to the budget, whatever it's called, advisory group? A work session, budget work session group with advisor members before it comes to the board, so we can have a lot of dialogue,
Yeah.
rather than have them come to the board, because it gets confusing to the public. That's my concern.
That's all we're suggesting, Commissioner, is that we clear up some of these terms in clarifying the procedures of the board.
So we will be looking at that in the next few days then. You'll get that out to us?
I would hope that we would get something out
Yeah.
there, and that
Right.
what we would put on the agenda for Tuesday is for you to continue this conversation. I don't know that we're going to make a recommendation. Maybe, I don't know that we'll make a recommendation, but I think those
Engineer,
three
you-
issues need to be resolved.
Are you
Right.
comfortable with that at the next meeting? Because you're not going to be here, right?
Mhm. I'll be fine. I
Okay.
can email.
All right.
Should we
Right.
talk more about the recording and the,
So, but let's, before we go there, let's just make sure that this is defined, how we're going to do this. We'll receive some questions from Jeff. Okay. So we're good with this?
So are we assuming that we're going to have the board at the budget meetings, or,
Commissioner, we're asking, we're going to provide the context
okay,
of all of those questions about how we organize our board discussion for 2020,
okay,
and you will still have to decide that as a board at a meeting.
okay, next week.
I'm not going to make a recommendation. I'm going to lay out all the options that you have available.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Then, moving on to the recording. Your thoughts,
should we
Dave?
talk more about that? I mean,
Mhm.
You know, everybody's different, and so I can understand the chill effect and not being able to ask the dumb questions or whatever. I'm quite comfortable doing that, but I know that others are not, and I don't know if some of us, others are not or what, but, so I'm kind of, I recognize the chill effect, it just doesn't affect me, so it's hard to maybe see the full impact of that.
Perhaps a way to further clarify that is in work sessions where we're talking about policy alternatives. When we've been recording, we are creating data. And we have not created data because we have not brought stuff to the board for action. So by recording work sessions, we are creating data that is conflicting. When we have a conversation about a jail study, and we're talking about this level, and then we're talking about that level, and then the public gets confused and say, last week it was this number, this week it's this number.
Sure.
We've created data before we created data.
Sure.
I'm not concerned about the chilling effect. I'm concerned about the creating of data that's been used inappropriately.
Sure.
People take conversations
That-
we have at committee of whole and make it a decision. And it's not a
Sure.
decision,
Active.
it's a discussion, it's a brainstorming. I'm going to go out of this context. When I was first elected, we had a transportation seminar with Oberstar when he was still alive, and it was a brainstorm, and it was, put it all out there as crazy as it is. So I threw a crazy idea out, and all of a sudden the highway department is saying County Commissioner Duke Kirk wants to shut down all the roads and put in toll booths. Because it was recorded, and so it happens.
Yeah, can
I know
see
you're
that.
not restricted in asking dumb questions and you're comfortable on camera, but I personally am sick and tired of my comments during committee of the whole being thrown back in my face and used to attack me. I would like to be able to use these sessions to learn and to do better and to make better and to feel free to do those decisions and, you know, maybe even sometimes be kind of silly so it's not so stressful having these conversations, and that's really hard to do
Yeah,
with a camera on, knowing that someone's going to use it against you.
yeah.
So, but whatever you guys decide, that's fine.
Well, you're part of the decision.
I know, but I'm one person, and I know that a lot of you are concerned about your constituents wanting to see every single thing we do, because
Yeah, I mean, when I was not on the board, I would have liked to have seen as much as I can. But again, things can get taken out of context. It's just not productive necessarily creating the data before there's actually data. And I see a lot of problems, and it's really interesting. Now, being on the board, I can see why you wouldn't record the work sessions. But for Joe Public, that's pretty bad. You know, it's.
I think it's really, really important for you to contact your peers in other counties, because nobody is recording work sessions.
No, I've asked, yeah.
Nobody is doing it. It's a bad practice.
So-
They laugh, actually.
What would we,
No.
how would we
because they
define a
can't
work
cry.
session? So the jail information night, was that a work session, or information only? Or how would you describe something
This-
like that?
This is a work session, Madam Chair, where we get together and the board as a body discusses policy alternatives, asks for clarification, asks staff to do research without having to make a decision.
Yeah.
Mhm.
The jail one would have been a town hall public info, so that'd be in the green area.
Right.
And so what I'm feeling more comfortable with at this point is having green areas on this table, not the.
You as commissioners can have public meetings by yourself at the coffee shop any day you want. You can work with staff to have a public information session about anything that we're developing. And we have. We held the one on the 1854 treaty. We held the one on the jail. We've held several on County 45 and County 17. Some of them are district specific, some of them are topic specific, some of them could be completely open. Tell us what you're thinking. You have all that latitude. I'm just suggesting that they fit better outside of the business of the work sessions and the board meeting.
And where does it fit in then with recording it?
I would recommend that we don't make data. Those aren't business meetings. Business meetings are where we're making data.
And maybe, as Myron suggested, we take board action. So the jail meeting, we all said, yeah, let's have this jail meeting, let's provide information for the public. So it wasn't a work session, it was providing information. And then we make crystal clear, right then and there, we as a board, this meeting on this situation will be live streamed, or it won't be. And we know, because.
I would make the decision before you pick a topic, Commissioner.
Okay,
I
that's
would
fine.
suggest that you decide, are the town halls or the public meetings all going to be recorded or not going to be recorded? Because if you do it based on the topic or based on who you anticipate is going to be in attendance, you're creating a problem.
Well, the town
And that's what
halls.
we've done in the past.
The town halls never have been. So.
They have. We had a town hall about the towers, and we recorded it because it was at the time of the year when we were able to do it that we knew the majority of the citizens wouldn't be available. So had we had a policy, we wouldn't have had to have made that decision.
So the tower one, I'm thinking about the town halls that we go around to the 5 districts.
They're-
They've not been recorded.
They're all the same, and we
Okay.
have not had a consistent policy.
Yep.
And we have
Okay.
reacted to public,
Yep.
individual requests
Yep.
that affect our choice for each of these matters. And that's created, if you want to talk about transparency, not making consistent decisions is one of the way that you subvert transparency. Making a consistent decision.
That's going to be the hardest
We
part of the policy.
we overcame it 3
No.
years ago when we decided not to record those meetings. And then we changed our minds.
Well, I think we have to take in consideration also the public, and sometimes during the year, there are, like the jail, people are not here, they want to know what's going on. It is a work session, it is this or it's that, however we define it. Then the next step would be maybe a public hearing, then that would be recorded. So we need to find out or decide what's the first step of public information, and then move on to the next one. But,
And maybe town halls, we just have minutes taken, and then the public has access to it.
Again, you're creating data
Okay.
when you're not creating data.
It's easier to record it.
so,
That's creating
Molly,
data.
could you explain what you've been hearing now about having data and having just the public know or be informed about some topics that we feel are important for everyone to be informed on?
I'll start by saying that MCIT recommends you not record anything. no video recording of anything other than what's legally required, which is the closed meetings, not attorney-client privileged closed meetings. And one of 3 reasons that they cite for that is data retention. Once you create that recording is something that must be maintained and the integrity maintained and stored according to Official Public Record Act rules. So it also is data that you have to, that is subject to public data requests, so you have to make sure you can find it and distribute it when it's requested according to those rules. And finally, if you, the 3rd reason they cite for not recommending recording is because of ADA compliance and the Minnesota Human Rights Act. You have to actually have a transcript available for any deaf or hard of hearing person. Once you create that video, that is a service you're providing, the same, and you have to accommodate those with disabilities to be able to access that service.
Does that include our regular board meetings?
It's a closed meeting.
Any recording, you have to have a transcript accessible. I'm not sure if we're doing that right now. So, and then I think that open meeting law, whenever there's a public meeting, so a quorum is present and there's county business, requires that minutes be taken, but I could be, I might need to.
And to summarize that, minutes be taken, but if it is a town hall meeting, the minutes would be that a public meeting was held and the proposed jail study was discussed.
Right,
because there's no action.
action.
So the minutes have to document the action of the governing body or describe the general conversation at the meeting. So minutes for those things are really a sentence. A meeting was held at this date and time, and this was the topic. That's what's required for documentation.
So if we have the board as a quorum at a budget, at whatever we call our budget advisory committee meeting, then we have to follow the announcement of having a meeting or a quorum.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be then
Public meeting.
be a public meeting. Whereas if
A
it's a
quorum
committee meeting, then where you only have 2 commissioners, then it's not a public meeting.
Yep, you don't need.
That's
that
getting
published
back to my
notice.
point earlier that, you know, when we have a quorum, then you have a different kind of meeting.
Does that go with radio interviews too?
If there's 5 or 3 or more
No,
of us?
as far as recording, doing
No,
an
'cause that's
interview.
not our data, that belongs to them.
Okay.
They're creating the
Yeah.
recording, they're in charge of what they do.
You know, I think we've been seeing that in the last, well, since I've been a board member, that
Yeah.
we have our video and then we get the newspaper and, you know, there's a cut here and a cut there and a cut here and a cut there and, you know.
Mhm. And that's my concern in the work sessions, is that
Yeah.
a whole new story is created.
Okay, well,
And
any
then
other
I didn't
thoughts?
even realize all of the data requirements, and, I mean, I know we spend a lot of time and money on data retention and pulling things up and finding things for people, and,
Yeah.
Well, and one of the reasons that I felt pretty strongly about recording everything all the time.
because you want to be famous.
Well, that's the primary
Yeah.
But secondarily, it's for transparency and to
Right.
build public trust. That's something that I feel very strongly about, building public trust. Well, it turns out it doesn't seem to be working that way.
No, it's working the opposite.
And that's my, I mean, that's my real primary reason.
Okay,
Then
yeah.
I feel like it's undercutting us.
Was it you and I were the only two? Dave and I went to the Blandon leadership training, and my topic was building trust with the public. And I think you were the only other one on that committee with me.
I wasn't on that committee. We were just a small groups.
There's only one other person on there with me. Nobody wanted to do that topic.
So do
Well,
we have
if I
any?
could just say that I think listening to our county attorney and our county administrator is important, and also to look at MCIT, recommendations. And we've tried this, and I'm all for transparency, but if it creates another whole level of controversy, then it's not serving its purpose.
Right.
But I think our town hall meetings, or whatever we want to call them, our public meetings where we have dialogue like we did with the jail, was a really good session.
Mhm.
And that's where it belongs, and
We're still getting messaging out with our communications
Sure.
department about the meetings. We're still
Right.
providing that context. And that's part of how we communicate. We make that available, we let people know we're having that conversation, and then truthfully, at the board meetings where we're actually taking the action, we're providing the context and the board agendas and the workshops. And the question was asked at a recent meeting, when do we get to talk to commissioners before this stuff is discussed at the board meeting? Well, that's why we publish our agendas on Thursday, 3 days before the meeting, so they have the opportunity to contact you individually as their representative, or you as a group, and say what they feel about one of the things on the agenda. That's why the stuff is published early, so they have the opportunity to contact you ahead of time.
How many people are we actually reaching, with that? Not everybody's on social media.
The agendas?
Yeah, even with the thing that you put on,
The update?
updates
And the
and
county
stuff like that,
Yeah.
Yeah, we're only reaching
Well,
a
anyone.
certain group of people. I can name, I'll go on and on and on, the people that aren't on social media.
But you don't have to be on social media to get the agenda,
Do you
or
mean
the update, or the
Yeah.
minutes.
Do you mean the
I know
county?
people that don't even run computers.
Well, see, then, what's their responsibility too?
But she's 95 years old. What is
Well,
her responsibility?
No, but I mean, she could ask you.
They
if
call
she's
me
in your-
directly and
or
ask
call
me.
her. Or call
Tell
any
you, I
of
got an
us.
88-year-old that calls me and asks me.
Can I add some insight to that? Social media is one piece of a multi-channel communication strategy. Before it's put on social media, it's distributed equally to all media outlets, from local media all the way down to the city. So it's covered from the Duluth market, which covers TV, covers radio here. It's available here at the courthouse. It's also emailed. It's provided to all the MAT team and commissioners, as well as posted on our county website, available for subscription and RSS feed. So any way, there's a physical way to access it, there's a traditional media way to access it, there is a variety of electronic ways to access it. Social media is actually the last stop, which points to out of the other means of availability. And then as commissioners or administrator or MAT representatives, it's also available to request it.
Can't you still also purchase a copy? The old-fashioned paper one
Here
in
at
the mail?
courthouse, I believe so.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You don't have to purchase it.
You don't have to
No,
purchase it?
you can-
Okay.
Are there people who are on
Yes.
A mailing list.
There's
On the
a
yes.
mailing list of the board agenda every week.
Emailing.
Email.
Huh? No, there's a physical mail, there are people who get the full packet.
You get it on Monday.
It
Monday.
fits on one page of labels, so.
So I think there's a variety of ways that we need to help maybe elderly people or folks in our area, because I know when I'm out to townships, I'm always saying, these are your options, Call me, email me, website, whatever. So we need to kind of help folks to get information, and it's an ongoing reminder. Yeah. So what's our homework? What's your homework?
Our homework is to get something to the Budget and General Government Committee that summarizes what you want us to put on the agenda for Tuesday. So sometime in the next 2 days, we're going to have to get something to you that quantifies, that frames the discussion that the board will have on Tuesday. And if they decide not to make a decision Tuesday, then we continue with the rules as we understand them until we do make a different decision.
So the general committee's gonna take a stab at writing a policy?
The General Government Committee would be the committee that I would refer a question about bylaws or organizational policies to.
Okay.
So we're going to frame the question and see if Commissioner Bershheim and Storley agree with how we're framing the question, then we'll put it on the agenda for Tuesday. And if we don't have agreement, then we'll defer it and we'll just act as if things are the way that they are until they aren't.
Well, and the other thing is, I appreciate, Molly, this information. This is a lot to kind of absorb right now because we just received it, so maybe we won't be able to get a decision in the next week, but maybe in the next few weeks or whatever, but I appreciate you putting this together for us.
After this meeting, could we decide when we're going to meet as far as general government?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else?
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you all. It's good discussion, and I appreciate the fact that we can make our meetings more productive, however we want to call them, and define what we're doing. After all these years, it's kind of nice to, let's define what we're doing. Thank you. And thank you for the standing committee reports, too.
Yeah, thanks for all the work on this, the two of you. It's helpful.
It's kind of nice that we're in essence doing the policies of other counties, we just haven't put it in writing.
Well, sort of.
We're adjourned. As you're getting up.